Good. So today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Noah Efron, who's from the Bar Ilan University in Israel, who's just spent a night on the plane, which had some mechanical problems before takeoff, so longer flight than expected. And so we're very grateful to him for coming straight pretty much from Heathrow and being with us today. And then tomorrow he'll be speaking at the journalism course, which is going on also in Cambridge at the present time. So Dr. Efron is also the president of the Israeli Society for History and Philosophy of Science, so has a very extensive interest in that area. The past 10 years he's been chairman of the program in Science, Technology and Society, but has stepped sideways for this year to be a bit more political, and he's now an alderman in the city of Tel Aviv for this year to do, I think, practical applications of things. Maybe he'll tell us about that later on. He's also most recently the author of Judaism and Science, a historical introduction. So has really been engaged in many, many different aspects of the science religion discussion, and we're delighted he can speak to us today on a passion for the universal, science, Jews and others. Thank you.
I am just delighted to be here. This is somewhat of a mythic forum, and so it's wonderful to find myself in this thing that seems too good to be true. And I now, for some years, have known Dennis at first glancingly, and then over time have grown to appreciate his judiciousness and wisdom. And so it was really a pleasure to be invited. Now, an American boy, any American boy, celebrating his bar mitzvah, say any time from 1935 to 1960, was bound to receive among the Kiddush cups and the prayer books and other gifts that he got an oversized volume called From Moses to Einstein, They Are All Jews, by a man named Mac Davis. My father's copy sits on my shelf. The book never went out of print for 25 years. It made a popular coming-of-age present because it promised both entertainment, quote, "In this calendar of heroes and heroines you will find melodrama, ambition, power, courage, love, despair, poverty, and all the influences that make greatness," end quote. And it pledged uplift, quote, "To the youth, these stories will reveal the possibilities to which Jews may aspire." Now the book began with biographies of Moses and Bar Kokhba and Maimonides, but quickly enough it turned to such modern heroes as Abraham Schreiner, the Galicia Jew who first synthesized petroleum, or Siegfried Marcus, the Viennese Jew who engineered the first horseless wagon, Otto Lilienthal, the German Jew who designed the first manned aircraft, Albert Michelson, the Chicago Jew who calculated the speed of light and harvested a Nobel Prize, Paul Ehrlich and August von Wassermann, who discovered a cure for syphilis and garnered Nobel Prizes themselves, Karl Landsteiner, who devised blood typing, again winning a Nobel Prize, and on to Albert Einstein himself. Now one may learn two things from Moses to Einstein and from its long enduring popularity. First, that by 1/3 the way through the 20th century, Jews in the New World and the Old had registered remarkable achievements in physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, medicine, engineering, and more. And second, that the scientist Jews behind these achievements were a source of swelling pride for the great majority of Jews who'd never wear a lab coat, never titrate a solution, and never integrate a function. Jews had become important in science, and science had become important to Jews. And this was especially true in the United States, which will be the focus of most of my remarks, but it was in fact the case everywhere where both science and Jews thrived in the modern era in the 20th century. Now, already in the late 19th century, Jews found themselves at the forefront of German science, which itself was then among the most advanced in the world. In Germany, patterns emerged for the first time that would repeat themselves over the next half-century wherever Jews lived in large numbers. Jews flocked to universities in Germany, a great many of them seeking training in science and medicine. By 1891, German Jews were more than 8 times as likely as Christians to seek higher education, head for head. In 1891, 1 in every 6 medical students in Germany was a Jew, this at a time when 1 in every 100 Germans was a Jew. The percentage of Jews in mathematics, chemistry, and physics were greater still, and this at a time when these faculties were themselves rapidly expanding. Jews were a greatly expanding proportion of a greatly expanding population of science students in Germany. And as these Jewish students graduated, they entered scientific professions in ever-increasing numbers. In Berlin and Breslau, where Jews had the best showing, by 1874 already, 1 in every 4 university instructors was Jewish. Nationwide in that year, 1 in every 5 professors in Germany was a Jew. There were fewer Jewish teachers of medicine, chemistry, and physics, but they too far outstripped the proportion of the overall Jewish population in Germany. At the same time, Jews found places all out of proportion in scientific industry, working, for example, in Germany's world-class dye works and chemical factories. One can track in the minutes of the German Society for Applied Chemistry the rising din of complaints from year to year that the profession had somehow become overrun by Jews. An exaggeration, surely, but it's one that says much that's true about Jewish successes in the field. In 1897, a liberal Jewish politician named Joseph Karais allowed that though, quote, many poor Jews strive to accumulate the treasures of German culture, working in the sciences, some of them perhaps dying young as a result, their efforts are scarcely appreciated. Not many years passed before the Nazis denounced relativity theory as a degenerate Jewish science, as is well known to all of us, and called for the cleansing of science in general from the Jewish control under which it had fallen in Germany. Of the 100 Nobels awarded between 1901, when the prize was inaugurated, and 1932, when Hitler took power, 33 went to German scientists, and 1/4 of these went to Jews. That Jews had won the prize at a per capita rate more than 30 times that of Christian Germans was a disgrace to the proud Aryan, and a sign that something had gone dreadfully wrong. In its twisted way, this Nazi shame, too, was acknowledgement of the extraordinary success of Jews in German science. And Germany was only a beginning, what in time would come to seem like a prototype. The rise of Jews in science and medicine in Russia, and eventually even more in the Soviet Union, was swifter and greater still. By the last decades of the 19th century, the number of Jews in universities and in the professions for which universities prepared them had grown so rapidly that Russia's bureaucrats, pundits, and hoi polloi concluded that enough was enough. It didn't go notice that between 1/10 and 1/4 of physicians in each of the biggest cities in Russia were Jews, and this at a time when the number of Jews allowed into these cities was strictly limited. In the 1880s, medical schools, engineering schools, and technical schools across the country finally introduced rules limiting Jews. One government memo put it as such, quote, individuals of Jewish descent having a particular capacity for mathematics are more successful than others on the entrance exams. Each year, the percentage of non-Russians among engineers increases, and a large portion of management positions in factories and mines will pass into the hands of individuals of Jewish origin, end quote. This was, of course, not to be desired. Chaim Weizmann, who grew up in Pinsk and went on to become a renowned chemist in England and eventually the first president of the State of Israel, remembered that, quote, as, quote, produced very curious tragic-comic results. There were occasions when a rich Jew would hire 10 non-Jewish candidates, at a time rather oddly selected, to sit for the entrance examination at a local school and thus make room for one more Jewish pupil, needless to say his own son or protege, because only 1 in 10 applicants was allowed to be Jewish. The quotas remained in force until the Russian Revolution, amounting to what one Jewish newspaper at the time called, quote, a silent, invisible pogrom in higher education. These quotas were no less a tribute to the energy with which Jews sought to educate their way into science and through science into Russian society. Now, after the revolution, the silent, invisible pogrom ended abruptly. Officially, Soviet society would brook no religious discrimination, and in reality, Jews found fewer obstacles to obtaining education and employment in the USSR in its first decades than probably anywhere else on earth ever. The revolution had crushed the old elites in Tsarist Russia. This created opportunities for those who hadn't thrived under the old regime, opportunities exploited with brio by Jews with enthusiasm. Looking back, it's no surprise. For one thing, Jews were far and beyond the most literate group in the USSR. 85% of Jews could read in 1926, compared with 58% of the other Russians. By 1939, a Soviet Jew was more than 3 times as likely to finish secondary school as the average Soviet citizen. 17% of university students in Moscow were Jews, 19% in Leningrad, and 36% in Kiev. Jews were 10 times as likely to complete university studies as the general population. And 1 of every 3 college-age Soviet Jews studied at a university. By 1989, at the very end of the Soviet epoch, 64% of Jews had a university education, compared with just 15% of everyone else. These Jews went mostly into science and technical fields. In the early 1950s, 11% of all Soviet scientists were Jews, though Jews comprised only 1.5% of the population. In 1959, Jews were more than 13 times as likely to be scientific workers as other Soviets were. The top 5 Jewish occupations overall were engineer, physician, scientific personnel, teacher of math or science, or technical manager. And the first 3 of these occupations accounted for 1/3 of all Jewish employment. 4 of 7 Soviet Nobelists in physics were Jews, as were 30% of all Soviet prize winners over the lifespan of the Soviet Empire. It was after the Soviet Union disbanded and almost 1 million Jews emigrated to Israel, that the remarkable Jewish embrace of science in the USSR became most obvious. Over 60% of those immigrants who were employed before moving to Israel were engineers, scientists, physicians, nurses, technical workers, and other scientific professionals. What Jews had achieved in Soviet science was exceeded only by what American Jews had achieved the notion away. And that achievement was astonishing by any measure. 38% of American laureates in physics have had Jewish backgrounds. 42% of American Nobelists in physiology and medicine. 28% of U.S. prize winners in chemistry. 37% of national medals of science recipients. When last studied, over 1/4 of all the physicists at America's best universities were Jews. 1 in 5 mathematicians, 1 in 5 bacteriologists, 1 in 5 biochemists, 1 in 5 physiologists. Greater numbers of physicians are Jews, and greater percentages of the faculties at the leading medical schools in America are Jews. Who's Who of American Jewry of 1938, another book that I saw off my father's shelf, went to great pains to include everyone who had ever turned a good buck in the rag trade or the junk trade or retailing or manufacturing or any other business in which the Jews had begun to distinguish themselves, as well as every famous Jewish entertainer and athlete and newspaper man or writer or rabbi. Still, 1 in 6 of the 8,500 listings in the book, 8,477 listings in the book, were men and women of science. Beginning in the teens, Jews also played a growing part in bankrolling American science and medicine. Foundations established by Julius Rosenwald, Guggenheim, Platz, Filene, Strauss, Warburg, Schiff, Loebs, the Baruchs, the Lehmans, the Leuenbergs, the Seligmans, the Laskers, the Rothschilds, the Litauers, the Gimbels, the Adlers, the Fells, and on and on. Names who are known to anyone who's ever strolled through any Ivy League campus in the United States. I mean, the buildings one after another are named after these famous Jewish families. These families donated hundreds of millions of dollars, by today's standards, tens of billions of dollars, to hospitals for care and research, to universities to advance science, to research institutions, to planetariums, to aquariums, to science museums, to school science enrichment programs, and more. Jewish fondness for science also became part of everyday Jewish culture. Dozens of books were written in the 1920s and 30s and 40s cataloging the Jewish contribution, as they inevitably put it, to America, or sometimes more expansively, to civilization. These are basically the adult versions of From Moses to Einstein. Beginning in New York in 1927, the Jewish Academy of Arts and Sciences gathered scientists, doctors, and men of letters every month to debate scientific and scholarly matters, and, as far as I can tell, mostly to distribute awards and plaques and commendations one to another in great numbers. But they did this with the notion of advancing science among Jews, but no less advancing the notion that Jews are advancing science. Rabbis praised science from the pulpit, often lauding Judaism for its embrace of the same modern knowledge that seemed to irk so much fundamentalist Protestants who lived down the road. And what happened in Mainz, Moscow, and Manhattan happened on a smaller scale everywhere else as well. It occurred in England, in France, in the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, Poland, Hungary, and so on. In short, every Western country with ample measure both of Jews and of science, in every country with an ample measure both of Jews and of science, Jews excelled in science. And the inroads Jews made in the sciences in these places, achieving a surprising regard, were matched by the inroads science made among Jews, many of whom came to regard the study of nature with surprising respect. As Professor Jeffrey Cantor reported in his really magnificent book, Quakers, Jews, and Science, already in 1873, Meyer D. Davis, the editor of London's Jewish World, had reason ruefully to observe in the paper's inaugural edition that many of the city's well-heeled Jews were sadly enchanted by the teachings of modern science, which estranged them from the paths of faith in which they had been nurtured. The percentage of Jews in the Royal Society doubled from 1900 to 1920 and redoubled from 1920 to 1940 until the proportion of Jews to Christians in the society was 4 times as great as the proportion of Jews to Christians in the United Kingdom. By this time, Jews also accounted for 1/4 of all foreign fellows in the society, a matter of furtive pride to at least some English Jews. As the UK became a haven for Jewish scientists from the continent seeking to escape the Nazis, the number of immigrant Jewish scientists of the highest international reputation who came to call England home grew quickly, including Nobel laureates like Hans Adolf Krebs, Max Born, and Bernard Katz. Now, admittedly, the sorts of statistics that I've been citing are crude. Of course they are. For one thing, they catalog scientists by a trait, their Jewishness, that many of the scientists themselves thought was fully insignificant, meant nothing. They measure achievement in science by counting plaques and medals, ignoring the accomplishment of the vast majority of scientists who never received a phone call from Stockholm. And they're in the crass business of itemizing Jews, characterizing brilliant and complicated, unique men and women by a single trait, their religion. And this is a disquieting practice, given the ill associations we all carry of Nazi ledgers tracking Jews. It's just not the business that you want to be in, at least not the business I want to be in. Still, the successes of Jews in 20th century science have been so extravagant that even these crude measures make a convincing case. It is a simple fact that the achievements of science in the 20th century cannot be separated from the achievements of Jews in science. But why? Why were so many Jews from so many places so prominent in so many sciences? Why did science play such a prominent role among so many Jews in so many places? Well, there are many explanations, I'm sure. But today I'd like to focus on this. Science, as it came to be practiced in the 20th century, offered what many Jews most fiercely desired: a vocation that was meritocratic in nature, one with an ethos that rejected as a matter of principle the notion that people ought to be judged by their ethnicity or creed or background. The ideal of science, as many Jews came to understand it, was of an endeavor blind to the background of those who pursued it. As such, science seemed to offer Jews a tool without peer for entering into the non-Jewish societies in which they found themselves. It seemed to offer a seat at the table, and sometimes the breath-stoppingly elegant table of the Royal Society, say, or of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, or of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. Nothing but science offered that. Now, it's easy from today's remove to forget how novel, radical even, the notion of blind meritocracy was. Near the start of the 20th century in the United States, for example, Jews were customarily barred from most prestigious occupations. Top-tier law firms took few Jews, if any, and those they did take never made partner. One contemporary estimate ran like this, quote, "In general office work, about 90% of all jobs available in New York are barred to Jews," in New York in the 1930s. And though this estimate is almost certainly an exaggeration, it was in accord with the impression of many Jews of the day. Discrimination was documented in a great many fields: in banking, in insurance, in brokering, in advertising, in journalism, in upscale retail, in restaurants, and more. At the same time, some fields had come to be dominated in New York by Jews, like the garment trade or the fur trade, jewelry, accounting, drugs and tobacco stores, entertainment. But the fields in which Jews and Christians worked side by side as equals with equal opportunity, these were more rare. Basically, they didn't exist. Indeed, at the start of the 20th century, Jews who wished to enter even the sciences also met with some resistance. In 1908, Science magazine could still complain that, quote, "Democracy has not until lately joined itself with the educated classes for the promotion of scholarship. Scholars and scholarship and scientists have until now been the allies of aristocracy alone." But already in the early 20th century, this state of affairs was changing quickly in science, in the United States and indeed throughout the West. In the US, Andrew Carnegie helped spur this change when he set out at the start of the 20th century to reform both the universities and science itself. The Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching offered fat grants, but only to those universities willing to modernize, to relinquish Christian affiliation, to eliminate classical language requirements, to beef up their science instruction, to build labs with the most modern equipment, to begin to accept students without attending to their creed or background or religion. The Carnegie Institute of Washington, established in 1902, began with a $10 million gift, which was greater than the research endowments of all American universities combined at the time. And it was charged to encourage investigation, research, and discovery on a purely scientific basis. An important aim of the Institute, Carnegie said, was, quote, to discover the exceptional man whenever and wherever found, inside or outside of schools, and enable him to make the work for which he seemed specially designed his life work. This was just 1 year after the Rockefeller Foundation had launched the Rockefeller Institute to develop scientific understanding of the nature and causes of the disease and the methods of its treatment. These institutions and the many others they immediately inspired promised to remove the traditionalism and conservatism that stifled innovation and replace them with a new sort of science, the value of which was measured by the data it produced and not by the prestige of the men who produced it, and certainly not by their religion. Owing to such reformist efforts and to many other things, to the fact that increasingly science was run by government and by the public, to the fact that universities were changing themselves in all sorts of ways, to the fact that new European models of scholarship, like those embodied in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, were rising. The rise of Taylorism, of scientized administration, the rise of corporations and corporate research and development, and many other things. For all these reasons, the infrastructure of science as we know it today took new shape in the first decades of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine how new science as we know it really is. For instance, blind refereeing became a norm only 100 years ago. It became the norm in judging articles submitted for publication and proposal and for submitting research grants. Now, while some discrimination certainly persisted at every stage, at training and employment, advancement, public recognition, scientists and scientific institutions seem to be sidestepping with growing success the exclusionary leather armchair and brandy snifter Protestantism that had stymied American Jews in other areas. The most important scientific institutions in America were new, without stultifying elite traditions and without traditional elites. Suddenly, miraculously, they were open to anyone who could actually do science. Now, for those alive to it, there was ample evidence that science offered opportunities not found outside the laboratory. Jacques Loeb, a French Jewish biologist who stunned the world when he induced parthenogenesis by chemical stimulus, creating artificial life as the awestruck press had it, he was kept out of New York's exclusive and exclusionary Century Club because he was a Jew. He applied, and they turned him down. At just the same time, though, the Rockefeller Institute boasted of having the same great biologist on its faculty. In the eyes of many Jews, and not only Jews, it said something about science, just as it said something about Jews, that Loeb's work as a scientist was so highly respected. It said something about science and about Jews that Sinclair Lewis lionized Loeb as his fictional Max Gottlieb in his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, Arrowsmith, and that John Ford made a popular movie of the same book. Suddenly, Jews were heroes in movies and novels. And it said something about science, and it said something about Jews, that Loeb had become what one historian called the central symbol of pure science in America during the years between the wars. It said something also that Simon Flexner was the founding director of the Rockefeller Institute, a Jew, and that his older brother, Abe Flexner, founded the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, bringing Einstein to the United States. And it said something that Isaac Levin was appointed the director of the New York Cancer Institute, and that Max Cutler was appointed the head of the Tumor Institute of Chicago. And what it said was that the scientists were a vocation that Jews could enter, at which they could excel. Science for American Jews could be a career. What's more than that, it could be a calling. Science came to be seen as an ideal, and one that might provide meritocracy and more far-reaching democracy in America and elsewhere. Science, many Jews came to believe in the first half of the 20th century, should be embraced and advanced not just as a vocation, but also as a value, as an ideal. Just what sort of ideal or value was captured in an influential book by the Scottish-Jewish London mathematician Hyman Levy, published first in London and then in New York, both in 1933, going through numerous editions in both places. He wrote, quote, "The ideal of scientific knowledge is to reach a system capable of being isolated from the subjective world of every individual member of the human race. It would be a set of statements acceptable to all. The foundation of science are statements invariant with respect to the individual that produces them." The American Jewish sociologist of science, Robert K. Merton, whose given name when he was born was Meyer R. Shkolnick, quoted Levy in a moving essay called Science and the Social Order that appeared in the journal Philosophy of Science in 1938. Merton wrote that, quote, The sentiments embodied in the ethos of science are characterized by such terms as intellectual honesty, integrity, organized skepticism, disinterestedness, impersonality. It is a basic assumption of modern science that scientific propositions are, and here he's quoting Levy, are invariant with respect to individuals and groups. One sentiment which is assimilated by the scientist from the very outset of his training pertains to the purity of science. Science must not suffer itself to be the handmaiden of theology or economy or state. Of course, this view of science was far from uniquely Jewish. It was embraced and championed by many others as well. In fact, that's sort of the point. Among Jews, however, in the decades spanning the world wars and then beyond, Jews in the United States, of course, but also in the Soviet Union and here in England and in France and basically everywhere where both science and Jews thrived, among all these, this view of science was almost universally embraced. This ethos of science was championed in the speeches of Jewish scientists, which is perhaps unsurprising, but it was valorized no less in the last wills and testaments of Jewish philanthropists, in the essays of Jewish philosophers, in the addresses of Jewish politicians, in the articles written by Jewish journalists, in the plot lines of Jewish novelists. It was a view shared by German Jews and Austrians, by Zionists and anti-Zionists, by businessmen and union organizers, by Bundists and assimilationists, by Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jews. And this is surprising. Save for hatred of Nazis, I know of no other attitude that enlisted such broad consensus in this famously fractious community in its most fraught and divided decades, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Perhaps most striking is the degree to which science was embraced as well by rabbis. Even Darwinism, which was received at first with some discomfort by American rabbis, almost all of whom at that point were Reform Jews in the period before the Great Immigrations to the United States, even Darwinism was soon heartily embraced by Jewish religious leaders. Kaufman Kohler, the most celebrated American rabbi of the late 19th and early 20th century, he was the pastor of New York's storied Temple Beth El, and then the chancellor of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Kaufman Kohler, found comfort in evolution. He writes, Darwinism declares that creation is not explained through a miracle, but through the natural law of progressive development of life under favorable conditions. Does not this view of life harmonize perfectly with our comprehension of religion, which we do not recognize in form but in reform, which has its living power in the internal remodeling of Judaism and its messianic mission as progress towards a completed humanity? Years later, Kohler returned to this theme when he wrote an entry on evolution in the Jewish Encyclopedia, the magisterial Jewish Encyclopedia. He wrote, none of the essential contentions of Judaism is vitally affected by the proposition of the evolution school. The philosophy of the reform wing within Judaism regarding Judaism as growth, not a fixed quantity or a rigid law, and is still in the process of developing, has even found corroboration in the theory of evolution. Kohler evolution proved Judaism, certainly didn't conflict with it. Now, Kohler was an original thinker. Other rabbis saw things differently, of course. Isaac Mayer Wise, another important Reform rabbi and Jewish leader, he attacked Darwinism, suggesting his own alternative in which God is, quote, everywhere in all spaces, in all objects of nature, in every attribute of matter, and in every thought of mind. By the end of the 19th century, though, evolution had been accepted by nearly all American rabbis. In the years that follow, more traditional Judaism established itself in the United States. My grandparents, who were rabbis, moved to the United States from Russia then, and suddenly there were Orthodox Jews in America. They too immediately accepted evolution. Indeed, it's only recently, only in the last 5 years, that the most uncompromising Orthodox Jews of the United States have come to criticize science. It had no precedent until recently, and even now, I can count on one hand the number of Orthodox Jews, Jewish rabbis in the United States who have ever issued a critical statement about science or about evolution. In the great archive of American rabbinic sermons, science was championed 100 times for each time it was disparaged, probably 1,000 times. This was so, at least in part, because the ethos of science fit well with the social aspirations of the largely immigrant Jewish population in America, eager to establish a place for them in the country. In a popular 1950 book by Harry Golden called Jews in American History, Their Contribution to the United States of America, one finds the following, quote, science, like art, knows no racial or geographic compartments, since the ultimate aim is the service of mankind. Science does not set apart groups, nor does it know distinctions. Science's only concern is with the furtherance of human welfare. Jews, like every other nationality, have woven threads into the warp and woof of the pattern. If you attempt to remove a thread, the pattern will unravel. Every sphere of life is of a similar pattern and similar nature. We should carry the portent of its message into our daily life. What affects one thread affects the pattern. No group has a monopoly on anything. Everyone belongs to all everything belongs to all humanity. As Golden saw it, a science conceived as indifferent to the beliefs and ideologies of those who practiced it and those who benefited from it, carries a message that is crucially important to Jews trying to make it in America and everywhere else in the West, that no group has a monopoly on anything, and that everything belongs to everyone, Jew, Christian, Muslim alike. The biologist and writer Benjamin Grunberg, who taught high school science in a New York public school for years because he believed it offered children of immigrants a way to improve their meager circumstances, he saw in science the same message. He wrote in his book, Science and the Public Mind, quote, "The chief obstacles to science have always been fixed ideas and vested interests. Orthodoxies of all sorts, whether religious or political, whether moralistic or intellectualistic, are inimical to the spirit of inquiry. An appreciation of the development of science as a great cooperative enterprise of mankind is likely to promote solidarity and to make each individual feel a sense of unity with all of his fellows. Science is a means of broadening the sympathies and cultivating tolerance toward other groups, races, nationalities, tastes, and philosophies. Science," Grunberg concluded, "is a means of building a liberal society, a decent society, in which all citizens, regardless of background, find equal opportunities to thrive." Oddly, perhaps, many Soviet Jews also found in science an ideology that fit well with their most cherished visions of what Soviet society could be and ought to be, though seldom was, in fact. Science in the first half of the 20th century was associated with progress, improvement, and modernity everywhere, but nowhere more than in the Soviet Union, whose prophets and leaders, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, had each described their outlook as scientific and praised science as a means for reconstructing society on a better basis. When the American physicist Harutun Dadorian returned from a long trip to the Soviet Union in 1930, he cannily observed that, quote, "Science and the scientific method have assumed an importance in the minds of Russian leaders second only to communism. Immediately after the revolution, many young Jews embraced science because they believed that science fit well with the goals of the revolution, about which they had not yet grown cynical. They saw in science both a means of achieving progress and a tool for demonstrating that they themselves were progressive, far from the petty bourgeoisie shopkeeper image often associated with Jews in the Russian imagination. And this went hand in hand with what, for some, in the first decades after the revolution in any case, was the source of science's greatest appeal. Many Jews embraced science because science itself was seen as so valuable to the revolution. To be a scientist was to be a soldier for the Soviet cause without actually being a soldier. It was a way to demonstrate commitment to the Soviet ideal and to the Soviet Union. And when the corruptions and oppression of the Soviet regime became too blatant to ignore, science was a profession through which one could remain a contributing Soviet citizen without being overly involved with degrading ideological casuistry that was so often part of Soviet life. Informants, loyalty tests, censorship, sadistic party apparatchiks, and all the other dreary aspects of life under Stalin turned up in the laboratory, but they turned up there far less than they turned up anywhere else. Certainly in any intellectual profession in the Soviet Union. In short, even in the Soviet Union, science provided Jews a profession that was modern, progressive, praiseworthy, and at once universalistic and patriotic. In this, it issued opportunities similar to those that many American Jews sought from science, just as some 19th century German Jews had sought them before them, and Jews elsewhere in Europe sought throughout the 20th century. When the great emigrations of Soviet Jews to Israel began in the 1970s, waves of these Jews brought with them scientific training and skills and expectations that these would somehow smooth their assimilation into their new home, Israel. These expectations were, after all, the very same expectations that had drawn many of these Russian Jews and their parents and grandparents to science in the first place. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote that science appeals to Jews because it provided, quote, a royal road of flight from Judaism itself, offering to fight the particularist conceptions that set them apart. This is what accounted, as Sartre saw it, for the Jews' remarkable what he called, quote, passion for the universal. And I think he was right. Science was thrice useful to Jews seeking to adopt American or European or Soviet culture and to be adopted by these societies. Because it was, one, an avenue into these societies, and because, two, it offered a way to remold these societies in a more tolerant image, and three, because it provided an abstract justification for ceasing to identify Jews as Jews at all. Such identification, Jews and others insisted, was at odds with the very ethos of science itself, which embraced, ostensibly at least, a hard-nosed objectivity that could not brook judging people by the antiquated beliefs of their grandparents. Sartre captured the logic of this ethos when he wrote, quote, "Of all things in this world, reason is the most widely shared. It belongs to everybody and to nobody. It is the same to all. If reason exists, then there is no French truth or German truth. There's no Negro truth or Jewish truth. There is only one truth, and he is best who wins it. In the face of universal and eternal laws, man himself is universal. There are no more Jews or Poles. There are men who live in Poland, others who are designated as of the Jewish faith on their family papers. An agreement is always possible among them as soon as discussion bears on the universal. The best way to feel oneself no longer a Jew is to reason, for reasoning is valid for all and can be retraced by all. There is not a Jewish way of mathematics. The Jewish mathematician becomes a universal man when he reasons." End quote. Science itself, reason itself, seemed to demand that the Jewish mathematician not only view himself as a universal man, but that he be viewed that way by all others who took seriously science and who took seriously reason. In a 1953 lecture, Robert Oppenheimer quoted Bishop Thomas Spratt's description of the Royal Society. This is Oppenheimer quoting Spratt. "Their purpose is, in short, to make faithful records of all the works of nature or art which can come within their reach. It is to be noted that the members of this organization of savants have freely admitted men of different religions, countries, and professions of life. This they were obliged to do, or else they would come far short of the largeness of their own declarations, for they openly profess not to lay the foundations of an English, Scottish, Irish, Popish, or Protestant philosophy, but a philosophy of mankind." Oppenheimer added that reading this today, quote, "reading this today, we can hardly escape a haunting sense of its timelessness" in 1953, because Spratt's agreeable and noble goal of using science as a cornerstone of a philosophy of mankind had still not yet been achieved. "Our faith, our binding, quiet faith," Oppenheimer concluded, "ought to be that knowledge is good and good in itself, no matter who delivers it and what his religion." The power of science, in Oppenheimer's view, is that it provides ground, good, solid ground for a quiet faith that binds men and women whose more boisterous faith, their Judaism, their Protestantism, their Catholicism, their Islam, too often rends asunder. This view that science can and ought to be blind to the beliefs and backgrounds of scientists and the rest of us has lately fallen into shabby disrespect. Popular faith in the goodwill of science and scientists has wavered. Hiroshima, Chernobyl, weapons-grade anthrax, global warming, and the many other products of scientific genius that now populate our nightmares have shaken the once commonplace belief that science and technology are engines of human progress and human progress alone. Recent academic studies of the history of science, medicine, and technology have tended to emphasize biases of race and gender and focus on how science has served the moneyed or the powerful at the expense of all the rest. And in a very different way, religious partisans, advocates of teaching creation science in the American public schools, for instance, have criticized science for its unfair secular bias that corrodes Christian piety. Science has recently become a battlefield on many fronts, attacked from the left and from the right. In this fractious atmosphere, it's with some poignancy that one recalls how Benjamin Grunberg, a child of poor Russian Jewish immigrants in New York, described in 1935 science as, quote, "a means of broadening the sympathies and cultivating tolerance towards other groups, races, nationalities, tastes, and philosophies." As he watched at that awful time, 1935, as he watched brown-shirted thugs gaining power across the sea, he insisted that the antidote to bigotry could be found in science. This was too much to expect, perhaps, but the loveliness of Grunberg's ideal, which was shared by so many Jews in so many places in modern time, the loveliness of Grunberg's ideal stands undiminished today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. No, thank you. We've got good time for questions, and that's great. So it's over to you, please, for questions and discussion. Yes, Rodney. Yes.
Science might be open to Jews, and that's very interesting, but I mean, the Olympic Games are in theory open to me, but I don't have the aptitude or gifts that might be necessary to get myself into the Olympic team. So is there nothing about, aptitude or ability or something that's in the...
I'm so happy that you asked that question. I believe the answer is that there is absolutely nothing about aptitude per se. There was just last week a big article in Israel's biggest daily about, it's sort of a perennial article, but I was played a big role in it this time, about Jewish genius. Is there such a thing? And I think the answer is there's absolutely no such thing. And let me explain this way. In the 1920s and 30s in London, and in New York, well over 50% of the most successful boxers were Jews. Boxing was a Jewish sport on both sides of the pond. And people complained about the fact that it seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't a Jew to get into the sport. And hypothesized, I wondered, could it be the case that there's something in Jewish genes that made them such good boxers? And I think that boxing is very, very similar to science. I'll in many ways. For any of us who've ever submitted an article, you'll see you sometimes feel pummeled. But I'll submit another sort of proof text, or what I take to be a proof text of this in a moment. I think that the story is people who see this as an avenue to advance, who see this as being an embodiment of the highest possible human ideal. It has this intoxicating position of representing doing well for yourself while doing good for the world, for all of humanity, of being valorous and advancing yourself, of being selfless and selfless at once. And it set off this spark of huge commitment and energy and interest. One fifth of all medical students in the 1920s in the United States were Jewish, but more than 2/3 for a period of all applicants were Jews. They just were deeply, deeply committed to this, and it became part of the structure of their life and culture, and people succeeded. And the other proof text that I would submit is that this story of Jewish success in sciences, and particularly in America, is waning, clearly now. So that there's no reason to believe that the next generation, it's still, the proportion of Jews who are getting Nobel Prizes is quite high, though the Nobel Prize being what it is, most of them are in their 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. The younger generation doesn't exist. In the United States, they've largely been replaced by students who are also immigrants, like these Jews that I'm talking about are immigrants, but immigrants from Asia, from China, largely. And the social patterns that those immigrants have really resemble enormously the social patterns that Jews had 60, 70 years ago. They might also have spectacular smart genes. I recognize that that's possible, but I think it's not. I think it's a human thing. I think that embracing science with such passion and such commitment that begins from the age of 0. It's parents educating their children to this. It's rabbis telling their students, no, don't become a rabbi, become a physicist. that over the course of time produces this remarkable cohort.
Thank you. Yes, oh, lots of hands there. Please, yes, we'd like to. Yes.
I wanted to ask, you said you quoted, he is best to wins it, I believe? You quoted someone saying he is best to wins it, I believe?
Yes.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you, could you maybe comment on Jewish women and all of that, other than a sort of PC afterthought of Jewish men and women?
That's an excellent question. Jewish women women in sciences, and particularly in medicine, but in sciences and or at least some sciences, were also more, if compared to non-Jewish women, have the same kind of levels of successes as Jewish men as compared to non-Jewish men, which, and that's a very ambivalent statement. It says two things at once. It says both that Jewish women were successful beyond what one might expect in comparing them to the general population, and it says that obviously within Jewish culture and within general culture there were great barriers to women entering the sciences. In medicine, the place of Jewish women was much greater. In biology, it was much greater. In physics, it was much less. In mathematics, it was somewhat mixed. In engineering, didn't exist at all. I've never heard of a Jewish woman before 1950, a Jewish woman engineer. So I think that some of the ideological pressures or inspirations that I tried to describe acted just as much as upon women as men, and at the same time the kind of barriers that we know existed with the full force that they existed for anyone else.
Yes, please, yes.
To follow up your answer to the first question, you mentioned that the level of disproportionate achievement in the sciences was in decline in the US. Which perhaps might be explained by more egalitarian society generally, so that you could pursue lots of different career opportunities. Would that also, would another piece of support for your explanation be that if you looked at Israel as a society, which is predominantly Jewish, it's not proportionately as productive of, say, Nobel laureates as the not dissimilarly sized American Jewish population, albeit there might be funding issues as well in the university system.
Yes, I think I'm smiling because I've been in academia in one form or another for 20 odd years, and I don't think anyone has ever said, here's something that supports what you said in the form of a question that's very lovely. I think that that's exactly right. I mean, sometimes the way that I put it is anyone who wonders whether Jews might be smarter than other people ought to try to call up the phone company in Israel when there's a mistake on their bill, and you'll find that we are as frustratingly stupid as absolutely. I mean, I think that there were great expectations with Israel's founding, and the laying of the cornerstone of the Hebrew University was attended by Albert Einstein, and the first institute that was opened in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was the Institute for Mathematics that held his name. People thought that this was going to be a technological and scientific miracle. And Israel is quite good in sciences in many ways, but nothing even remotely miraculous or nothing different than what one would expect of any country that makes the kind of investment that Israel did, for better and for worse. So I think that that's exactly right. I think that the notion that there might be something unique either in Jewish genes or in Jewish modes of education, or that produces great scientists, simply doesn't stand by scrutiny. And the more interesting story is why in one certain time, why basically for 75 years, Jews were, or 100 years, Jews were remarkably have been or were remarkably prominent in this, and never really before, and probably not to any enormous degree after as well.
There's a question here, please. Yes.
I know also a lot of good musicians and philosophers who are Jews. And does the same apply to them? As you, I think you said something about they wanted to make themselves a place in the society. They wanted to climb the meritocracy. But why did they want to climb in the society? Why did they want to in a way, have success? Was it connected to Judaism in some kind?
Well, first of all, thank you. I think that that's true, that Jews have been disproportionately successful and prominent in music in the West, and also in philosophy. Also, I guess in entertainment in the United States. I mean, Hollywood. And I think that what is common to all those professions, including the scientific professions, is an effort to construct a realm that is filled with grace and beauty that bears no traces of its particular origin. I mean, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a Jewish philosophy. Certainly not in modern times. I mean, maybe one could talk about Maimonides in some fashion or another. There's no such thing as a Jewish aria or symphony. Not really. There's no such thing as Jewish physics, and the appeal of that for people who rushed out of ghettos and found themselves in the modern West, indelibly viewed, inevitably, as Jews by all who saw them. The appeal of suddenly being able to be a human being, and a human being producing and partaking of culture at its highest level. The appeal of that, I think, is understandably huge, because it describes both a vocation individually and a world in which they need never have concern about being treated as second class or being concerned about their own position. I think so in that sense, I think that there's Jews exhibited an attraction to universalism, to expressions of universalism as they understood it. I mean, all of this is in the context of Western culture only, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything to do with traditional Jewish texts or Jewish practice. Just has to do with the odd position that they found themselves. In 1850, basically all of Europe's Jews, all of the Jews of the West, were living among Jews in small Jewish settlements. Very few of them, as late as 1850, very few of them lived in cities. And by 1920, then the vast majority live in these huge Western capitals. And how do they find a place for themselves? Grandparents who spoke Yiddish, and now they find themselves speaking German and English. How do they find a place for themselves? Well, in a society that's sometimes that is only partially open to them. Well, there are two things you do. You reform yourself by changing yourself from the Jew your grandmother was into the human being that you wish to be, and you change your society by insisting that the most valorized part ought to be that which is universal, that which has no truck at all with identifying people by their religion or by their ethnic background. And that was the dual move that science and music and philosophy allowed so well, and that's why it was catnip. That's why it was so very, very attractive.
Do you want one quick comeback there?
Does that also
yes.
mean that they lost their Jewish roots?
I think a lot of this went along with, in some cases, an unconscious and in some cases a conscious attempt to lose their Jewish roots. Yes, it cut both ways. When you want to become a human being, instead of when you want to be looked at as a human being and not as a Jew, then I think if you're intellectually honest, you look at yourself as a human being. And of all these Nobel laureates, of all the hundreds of Nobel laureates that I've spoken about, none have been practicing Jews. Zero have been religious, have been wear kippah or eat kosher food or keep the Sabbath. Not a single one. And I think that that's very telling.
Yes, back, please.
Following on that question, in relation to this sort of secularist universal ideal that the Jewish scientists or the Jewish scientific community were particularly interested in, what kind of relationship did that Jewish scientific community have with Zionism? Were they sort of generally against it? Or is it just a much more complicated thing? Do you see what I mean?
Both. They were generally against it, and it is a much more complicated thing. I think Einstein is of course so sui generis that he's representative of nothing. But it is interesting to think about his attitudes. He had no native sympathy for Zionism. He basically thought that it was a retreat back to the sort of tribalism that we ought to have been overjoyed to be rid of. I think that he felt that it was somehow uncivilized, and yet looking from his quiet home on Nassau Street in Princeton back overseas to what was happening in Europe, he became a Zionist, and he raised money for Zionists, and he contributed to Israel, even though he didn't. Palestine, mandatory Palestine, what would become Israel. The Israelis, once Chaim Weizmann was no longer president, famously asked Einstein to become the second president of Israel, and he turned it down. It seemed like a crazy notion to him. It was the last thing he wanted. He really had very, very little sympathy for the place in principle and in fact, and yet he thought that it was crucial in light of the tragedy that he had seen just unfolding in front of his eyes in Europe, that there be a place where Jews could go to. And I think that in many ways that reflects the views of a lot of people of that time. But the people who founded the universities in Israel expected there to be this massive migration of scientists over to Palestine. And if you go into the archives and you can just read letter after letter of disappointment. It's like, where are they? They refuse to come. We keep saying we'll build a laboratory, but they keep going to the United States or staying in London, and they just don't come here. And that's because I think by and large most of them thought that was anathema, that was really the opposite of what they sought in life.
Well, I think we'll just make this the last question, then we should stop.
How did the African Americans benefit in any way because of Jewish immigration to the States? The institutions that were set up.
How did? Well, that is a very interesting and very complicated question. Jews, like my parents, take great pride in their lifelong commitment to the civil rights movement. And I guess among my very, very earliest memories is going to the famous rally with Martin Luther King, at the mall in Washington, and on the wall of my school where I grew up was a photograph of Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a famous American rabbi, marching arm in arm with Martin Luther King. Jews were at the forefront of founding some of the institutions, the American Civil Liberties Union and others that really fought for civil rights. So one of the little pious stories that a lot of American Jews tell ourselves that has some foundation but is also more troubled than the way we normally describe it is that Jews were at the forefront of fighting for civil rights for African Americans, for blacks. I think that's true. But and I think that it went hand in hand with this kind of ideal. What American Jews were in all sorts of ways were deeply committed to trying to unravel the white Protestant hegemony in politics, in culture, and society. And civil rights provided both an outlet for that and in some ways a way to be fighting to make America more convivial to Jews without seeming to do it in a way that was self-promotional. It's like when you fight for the rights of, when you're a Jew in the late 1940s fighting for the rights of blacks, or the early 1950s, you are really fighting for the rights of Jews as well by proxy. So that it was this mix of deeply held commitments to what I take to be lofty and beautiful ideals truly, but also self-serving interests at the same time, which is why when in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when black leaders suddenly rejected Jews as being part of the establishment that was in fact holding blacks back, which is also true, so many Jews experienced it as an utter shock. They didn't see what I think a lot of black leaders truly saw, that Jews were willing to advance blacks to a point, but they were also deeply, deeply committed to advancing themselves.
Well, I think we'll have to stop that. We could go on. This is absolutely fascinating stuff. And thank you very much indeed, Noah, for a great seminar. Thank you.